Hi, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about what we call the 7 S's of crime scene investigation, which is essentially just a fancy acronym for how we want to approach a crime scene and how we want to investigate it very systematically to make sure that we're not missing anything or messing up anything. So the first thing we talk about is who is actually going to be at the crime scene. So your police officers are generally going to be the first responders. These are the people who are getting there first, and their major role is to what we call secure the scene. Make sure everyone is alive, or if not, provide any life-sustaining aid that they might need until paramedics arrive. They will be making sure that eyewitnesses are okay and separating them. They're kind of like first on the scene to make sure everyone is okay first. That's their number one priority, again, is securing that crime scene. Next would be a district attorney. So that would be dependent on whether or not a search warrant was needed. If that crime scene did need a search warrant to actually get into the scene itself, you might have a district attorney present to actually drop off that search warrant, but it kind of depends on the scene. You'll definitely have crime scene investigators. They will be arriving a little bit later once the scene has been secured. So again, that securing the scene is the first priority, the first thing we care about. After that, we're going to call the crime scene investigators in. Their major job is to not only document what's at the crime scene, but also to collect any evidence that is present. Your medical examiner will be there. If you have someone who has deceased, they will need to arrive to determine the cause of death, and then they will be responsible for taking the body out of the crime scene, getting it to the coroner's office, and start to investigate it. Detectives are who are going to work the scene. They are going to be talking to eyewitnesses. They are going to be talking to first responding officer. They're going to be talking to neighbors, pretty much anybody who is going to be at that scene and provide us any information. We want to talk to them. So that's going to be the detective's role. So you'll notice crime scene investigators here are not talking to witnesses. They're not talking to the other officers. Their sole job is to document the crime scene and collect the evidence. On TV shows, they will often show CSIs talking and what we would call working the scene, but that is not the norm. That's not how it's supposed to work. And then finally, you might have some specialists, and this is totally dependent on the scene. For example, if you have a dead body that's outside, it's going to have bugs on it, you would want to call an entomologist. So that's just sort of dependent on what it is that we're working with at that particular scene. So the first S is what we call securing the crime scene. The person who's responsible for this, again, is that first responding police officer, okay? Their first priority, so this is really important, they care about the safety of individuals. It does not matter if evidence is going to get ruined. If someone's life is in danger, that is their job. Protect the people that are at the crime scene, and if evidence gets lost, it gets lost. Then the second priority is to preserve that evidence. So if we find that, everyone is safe, everyone is alive, no one needs any like life-sustaining care, that's when they'll start to what we call preserve the evidence by first taping off the area, second, restricting anyone from coming and going. So like you might have nosy neighbors that see that a crime was committed and they're like, oh, I want to see. You don't let them in. Don't let them in at all. And then you try to make sure that this is not happening. We don't want evidence to be lost, contaminated, transferred in any way. So we are going to keep that crime scene as unaltered as possible. Then we have a log of everyone who had visited that crime scene. So this would include like officers. This would include medical examiner. This would include the CSI team. Anyone who's walking into that crime scene needs to sign in. So it's almost like how we have bathroom sign-ins and sign-outs. Same thing. Because if one of these people who are at the crime scene accidentally leaves trace evidence behind of their own, we want to make sure that they're accounted for. And we know that they were at the crime scene and we know what time that they were at the crime scene and the duration of time they were there. So that log is really important just to make sure that we have ourselves like covered in terms of who is present at that scene. And again, you might have to call in some forensic experts, but that's really, dependent on the scene itself. Okay. Can I click this? Why is this not? Okay. So the next one is separating witnesses. So in separating witnesses, we've talked about this. We do not want witnesses to be around one another. This can lead to a couple things. First, it can mess with their memory. So we've talked about memory before, right? It's very easy to get it messed up. The second thing is we don't want them to share their stories. If a witness has seen something, but they don't want the police to know, they might work with another witness in what's called collusion, where we have them working together to create a story. If they're separated from one another, right, they can't collude. They can't talk to each other about what happened and come up with a story that they're going to share to the police officers. So we want to keep them as separate as possible. In fact, we'll put them in different police cruisers so they physically can't be around one another. Then once we get all of those witness accounts, we are going to compare. They should be the same. If they're different, that leads us to believe something might be, confusing. Something might be wrong. Someone might have misremembered or misseen something. And then we're also going to check, does it match with the forensic evidence? If it does, awesome. If it doesn't, that's sketchy. That means something's going on here. So the kind of questions that we've asked should be very general. We don't want to ask anything specific. Let them guide the conversation and, essentially just see what information they can provide to you to the best of their ability. And it's going to really depend on your witness how good they are at doing that. Okay. So the next one is scanning the crime scene. This is where we're going to determine whether or not we're working at a primary crime scene or a secondary crime scene. The difference between these is a primary crime scene is where the initial crime took place. So if we're looking at like a robbery, it would be the site of the robbery. A secondary crime scene is some other location where evidence is going to be found. Okay, so if we're looking at a robbery, yeah, we'll find some evidence at the site of the robbery, but we'd also probably find some evidence at the home of the suspect. So you can apply this to lots of different scenarios. Anytime that you have evidence in two different locations, one where the crime took place, and two where you find other evidence that isn't the crime scene, those are both going to be important, and those are what we call our primary and secondary crime scenes. It's also at this point where we're going to see what photos need to be taken. So we're going to start to kind of scan and see what's available, and see what we're going to need to do first before we can actually pick up the evidence and move it. So we want to make sure that we know what it is that we're looking for specifically. So that leads us to photographing the crime scene. There's some different types of photos that we take, but we want to take pictures of the overall crime scene from several angles. So those are what we call initial photographs. Before anything's been moved, before anything's been touched, get an overall view of the room or the site that you're working in. From there, we start to take close-up photos. This is going to include typically something with a sort of measurement ruler, which you'll see an example of that on the next slide. After we search the crime scene, we mark the evidence. We're going to photograph it and once we get the pictures, we're then going to start to tag everything. And then we actually go through and make measurements based on where those objects are located. So let's say this is my crime scene. Okay, so I'm just looking at it from a top view. Here's the piece of evidence. I would want to measure how far it's located from this wall and this wall. So that way later, when I go to present this at a crime scene, I know exactly where I found it, because you're going to have to pick it up and take it with you. So you want it to be somewhere, like you want to make sure that you're recording exactly where you found it, so it doesn't look like you just added it in as a piece of evidence. We have to make sure it's all documented very clearly. Oops, sorry. Oh my gosh. Okay, so here's a great example of what good evidence photographs look like. You have a nice overall shot. So this is looking from above. So this would be what we call a ventral view, I think. Maybe not. It might be dorsal. It's a dorsal view. So if you take anatomy, but it's essentially looking down. So looking directly down on the object itself. So it's looking from above down. We also include that object for measurement, that ruler. So it's what we call a scale. We don't want to take this at any angles. We want it to be nice and straight on. We also don't want to have any people in our shot, any reflections. We want it to be a nice, well photographed image that's very clear for our jury to take a look at and actually be able to see something from. Okay, so types of photographs that we would take, establishing photographs are sort of an overall shot. Medium range photographs, a little bit closer, but we're seeing a couple different pieces of evidence potentially. And a close-up photograph, again, is going to be this. This is a close-up photograph where it's, directly this image, and it's looking at it from straight down. Here's an example of an establishing photograph, pretty far away, overall crime scene, lots of information here. This would be taken first. Then we go in a little bit further where we might have some evidence found. This is medium range. So I'm seeing a couple different pieces of evidence here. I'm not looking at everything individually. This would be a close-up photograph. Now, this isn't probably how I would have taken the picture. I would have included an item for scale, so I have an idea of how large this piece of wood is. But this would qualify as a close-up photograph because it's only showing one single piece of evidence, as opposed to a medium range where you're seeing multiple pieces of evidence potentially. So we also will sometimes use flash photography. If you have something in the shadows, it's going to be hard for you to see. So once in a while, you might want to use different kinds of filtering or flash photography or changing the light up a little bit just to allow yourself to see that image a little bit better. Also, we can use rulers as that scale object. A lot of times police officers will use dollar bills or coins because everyone knows they're about, their approximate size. But a lot of times we just use rulers because they're accessible for us in the classroom. So the next S is searching for evidence. So when we're looking at these different search patterns, you don't just want to walk into a crime scene and like randomly start looking for stuff because you're inevitably going to miss something. So typically in a normal crime scene, people would use a grid search, a linear search, or a spiral search, and it's really dependent on the officer or the CSI, whoever it is that's searching for the evidence, and what they prefer to do. So it's really up to them. Now, one thing to note is if we're looking at a quadrant or a zone search, these are particularly good in big areas. We're talking like acres and acres and acres of land. If I had something that was maybe, I don't know, let's say 2 miles by 2 miles, that's a significant amount of space that I need to cover as a CSI. There's no way that I could look at a huge crime scene like that in a spiral search. I would be walking forever. So instead, what we do in a large area crime scene, we'll take that, 2 miles by 2 miles area and we'll cut it into quadrants. Okay. Then we'll cut those quadrants into quadrants and we'll say, okay, team A, you're going to be here. Team B, you're going to be here. Team C, you'll be here. Team D, you'll be here. Next quadrant. Team E will be here. F will be here. So you're essentially just taking a huge crime scene and chunking it down much smaller. So you might have a team of people who are only responsible for searching area C, crime scene part C, and they're just looking for evidence in that tiny, tiny area, as opposed to the whole big thing, which would be very difficult to search in one of these other methods. Okay. Once you have the evidence located, you've searched the crime scene, you've now figured out where it is that it's located, you need to properly package it, seal it, and label it. So there are very specific protocols with handling evidence, how it has to get packaged, how it has to get sealed, and how it has to get labeled. The big thing is that we want to preserve the evidence. We don't want anything to happen to it that would put the evidence in jeopardy or potentially ruin it. So most of the time, like for example, biological evidence has to be put in something breathable. So if a CSI collects it, puts it in a plastic Ziploc bag, and throws it in the trunk of their car, that evidence is now considered destroyed and will not be allowed to be used in court because it could have grown mold during that time that it was airtight. Small evidence can also use what's called a paper bindle, which I'll show you in the next slide. This is really useful if you have something small that's easy to lose. It's almost kind of like internal packaging inside of your evidence container. So a paper bindle would look like this. So what you would do is you take your evidence inside, wrap it in the center, and then you're just going to fold these pages, like these layers over top of it. So that way, this little bindle is a little tiny envelope and you have the folds kind of sitting out here, but it's tucked inside and it's not going to be able to get out. So it prevents it from being lost. So it's loss prevention. You would only use this if you're working with trace evidence. So this is going to be really important for tiny stuff. But again, you're just sort of folding it in almost like a little Christmas package just to keep it extra safe and prevent it from getting lost. Because if it gets lost, we can't use it. And if we can't use it, it's not going to provide any value to us. So this would also be an example of an inventory label. Anytime you collect a piece of evidence, this piece of paper has to get filled out with it. And you'll notice at the bottom, it also has a chain of custody. We need to make sure we know who has the evidence at all times. It can never be unaccounted for. So anytime that the evidence changes hands, meaning like me, the CSI is passing it over to the evidence locker, which is at the police station, they need to sign that chain of custody form. So it can never have gaps in the chain of custody because if there's like, I don't know, 4 hours of time on a Friday where we don't know where the evidence was, who knows what happened to it? It could have been tampered. It could have been taken away. It could have had stuff added to it. So it's really important that when we're working with evidence, we are maintaining this chain of custody at all times. Okay, if it's found that a piece of evidence does not have a proper chain of custody, same thing if we mishandle the evidence and it's not packaged properly. If we lose track of where the evidence was at any given time, it has the potential to be thrown out in court and we can't use it. So it's really, really key that that paperwork piece is getting taken care of, because otherwise you don't know where the evidence was and you don't know what happened to it. The other thing is we want to make sure that we are sealing that evidence. We want to make sure it is like tightly sealed so that way if it gets opened, we would know. And we actually use a special kind of tape for this that's called tamper-proof tape, where it can only be placed on something once. And then once it's peeled off, it actually changes, like it has like a little message that's written in it that says opened or void. So that just tells us that, oh yeah, this tape has been opened. It's no longer a perfect seal. Okay, and then finally, we want to do a sketch of the crime scene. So while we're at the scene, we do a quick rough sketch. See what the crime scene looks like. I'm screencasting, sorry. Do you need something? Okay. So you want to do your rough sketch. Do that at the crime scene. Put where the evidence is, but it doesn't have to be perfectly measured exactly where it is. Then a final sketch is going to be done later after the fact based on those measurements. A lot of times now, we also use computer programs because it's much easier to do. And the computer does all the work for us. So who doesn't love that? So here are some different types of sketches that you can see. Whoops, we have an overview sketch, which is a floor plan. So you're just looking at it straight down. These are the most common. You have elevation sketches, which are good if like you have something up a flight of stairs and you want to sort of like show that, or if you have something on the walls of a room like bullet holes or something, you might want to show an elevation sketch so it's almost like you're looking at it vertically. We can also have cross projection, which is a little bit of both. So it takes the walls and puts them down onto 2 dimensions. And then a perspective sketch is really useful if a photograph is not going to help us. So if we look at this particular image here, like this, this gun, it has blood spatter on it, but guns are like a dark gray or a black color. So something like blood spatter might not show up in a photograph. So these are helpful if you have something that doesn't quite work well in a photograph. So you can see here, same thing. And I think, yep, okay. So when we create the sketch, you're going to take your measurements at the crime scene, make sure every piece of evidence is measured. You're going to lay out a rough sketch, and you're going to start to plot the evidence. We are going to use primarily this method, what's called rectangular coordinates. So essentially, your piece of evidence is here. You're just measuring the distance from one wall and the distance to another wall. So it's kind of like graphing how you have an X and Y coordinate. That just tells you where to use. So it's really good for indoor use. Otherwise, we wouldn't want to use it for like a really big crime scene. If we have a really big crime scene, we would want to use maybe something like a transecting baseline. So in an outdoor crime scene, I don't have walls to measure from. So I have to choose other things that aren't going to move, like trees, benches, something that's going to be stuck in place. We can also use what's called triangulation. This is going to use a little bit more trigonometry, so we are not going to use this for our purpose, but it is another option for measuring evidence as needed. And then that's going to be it in terms of notes for today. So I know this covered a lot of topics, but just make sure you know the big key features, the different aspects of a crime scene investigation, and why it's so important for us to do this in the exact same way every single time we get to a crime scene.